A German general played American jazz in a POW camp. 24 hours later, he was buried with full military honors on enemy soil. The American sergeant who wanted to kill him became the man who demanded the funeral. What happened between rage and respect? 5 words from a dying enemy. Pain has no nationality, son, and 17 minutes of forbidden music that proved humanity survives even when we try to destroy it. This is that story. July 23, 1944. Camp Concordia, Kansas. The piano key stuck, middle C, swollen from the humidity that turned the Kansas summer into a kind of purgatory neither German nor American had anticipated. General Kurt Reinhardt's finger pressed again, gently, as if coaxing a reluctant memory. The note emerged, slightly flat, trembling in the thick air of the mess hall where 217 prisoners of war had gathered not to eat, but to witness something they could not yet name. Reinhardt's hands, the same hands that had signed death warrants at Stalingrad, that had gripped field glasses while watching his Sixth Army dissolve into the Russian winter, now rested on yellowed ivory with a tenderness that unsettled every man in the room. His left shoulder, still bandaged beneath his threadbare uniform, throbbed with each breath. 3 weeks earlier, shrapnel from an American mortar had torn through muscle and bone as his convoy surrendered outside Cherbourg. 3 weeks earlier, he had expected to die in a French ditch, another aristocrat's body feeding foreign soil. Instead, he sat at a broken piano in the geographical center of America, about to play jazz. Outside, Sergeant Thomas Hendricks stood with his back against the mess hall wall, a Western Union telegram crushed in his fist. The paper had arrived at 0900 hours. 13 words that ended a world. Deeply regret to inform you, Private James Hendricks killed in action Normandy, July 19th stop, 4 days ago. His brother had been dead for 4 days, and Thomas had been here, guarding Nazis, counting them like inventory, feeding them better than most Americans ate. The baton hung heavy at his belt. His hand found it, fingers wrapping around wood that suddenly felt like justice, like purpose, like the only language that made sense anymore. The arithmetic of war. To understand how General Kurt Reinhardt came to sit at that piano, one must first understand the mathematics of expectation, the calculus of propaganda, and the geometry of collapsing certainties. Between January 1942 and May 1945, the United States imprisoned 378,643 German soldiers on American soil. They arrived expecting Untermensch savagery, cultural wasteland, industrial brutality disguised as democracy. This is what Goebbels had promised. This is what the Führer had guaranteed. This is what every fiber of their education, every particle of their indoctrination had crystallized into unshakable truth. Kurt Reinhardt was not a typical prisoner. Born in Potsdam in 1896, he had inherited a military tradition that stretched back to Frederick the Great. His father, General Wilhelm Reinhardt, had commanded artillery in the Great War. His grandfather had fought at Sedan. Warfare was the family business, conducted with the same precision other families applied to banking or medicine. But music was the family secret. Before the Nazi banner flew from the Reichstag, before the Nuremberg rallies, before the world divided into Aryan and other, young Kurt had spent 5 years studying piano in Paris. Not Beethoven, not Wagner, not the acceptable Germans. Instead, he haunted the jazz clubs of Montmartre, where Black American musicians, refugees from their own country's violence, created something new from the wreckage of old worlds. Art Tatum's impossible runs, Duke Ellington's architectural harmonies, the way Louis Armstrong could make a trumpet weep and laugh in the same phrase. His father never knew. What the Wehrmacht High Command never learned. What even his own men would never have believed. General Kurt Reinhardt, decorated in 2 wars, architect of the Kharkov offensive, possessed a collection of 73 American jazz recordings, hidden in a false bottom of his Footlocker, traveling with him from Poland to France to Russia and finally to captivity. They were still in that Footlocker when the Americans searched his belongings at Camp Concordia. Private Morrison, who cataloged prisoner property, found them. He held up a dusty album, Bessie Smith's downhearted blues, like it was a hand grenade with a pulled pin. "Sir," Morrison said to the camp commander, Colonel Robert Park, "you need to see this." The wound that wouldn't wait. The injury happened during the surrender, though surrender implies something more orderly than what occurred on June 24th outside Cherbourg. Reinhardt's convoy, 3 half-tracks, 2 motorcycles, a commander's car with white flags already flying, had stopped at the designated coordinates. The Americans were supposed to arrive at 1400 hours. At 1347, artillery shells began falling, not German, not American. British, as it turned out, operating on 48-hour-old intelligence that hadn't noted the surrender. The first shell killed Reinhardt's driver instantly. The second tore through the commander's car where Kurt was reviewing surrender documents. Shrapnel entered just above his left clavicle, exited below the shoulder blade, carrying with it fragments of bone and the brass button from his coat. He felt the impact as sound before pain, a thunderclap inside his body, his own blood suddenly external, impossibly bright against the gray interior of the car. Lieutenant Klaus Muller, 23 years old, pulled the general from the wreckage. The Americans arrived 16 minutes later. They expected to find corpses or cowards. Instead, they found German soldiers performing triage with the methodical precision of men who had spent 3 years in hell and learned to function in its bureaucracy. Medic Corporal James Wu reached Reinhardt first. Wu, whose own family sat in Manzanar internment camp in California, whose loyalty to America was considered suspect because of his face, assessed the wound in 30 seconds. Subclavian artery nicked. Possible pneumothorax. This man dies in 20 minutes without surgery. What happened next violated every expectation the general had cultivated about American medicine, American efficiency, American humanity toward enemies. They carried him to a field hospital, not after the American wounded, not after a wait befitting his rank among prisoners. Immediately. Within 7 minutes, he was on an operating table. Within 12 minutes, a surgeon named Captain David Rothstein, whose parents had fled Munich in 1938, was repairing the artery that should have already bled Reinhardt into unconsciousness. Kurt's last thought before the ether took him, "This cannot be real." His first thought upon waking 8 hours later with plasma running into his arm and clean bandages covering his shoulder, "I should be dead." His second thought, "They saved me." The arithmetic didn't work. The basic mathematics of warfare, of us versus them, of victor and vanquished, none of it explained why American doctors, using American blood plasma, American antibiotics, American surgical skill, had spent American resources to save a German general who had killed American sons. Rothstein came to check on him the next morning. Reinhardt's English, cultivated in those Paris years, returned despite the morphine haze. Why? The surgeon looked at him. Really looked, not the glance of categorization, but the gaze of recognition. "Because you were bleeding," Rothstein said, "and I'm a doctor." It was not an answer. It was not enough of an answer. But it was all the answer Reinhardt would get before they transferred him, along with 300 other prisoners, onto a transport ship bound for Norfolk, Virginia, and then by train to the geographical center of America, to a place called Kansas, which he had only known previously as the setting of The Wizard of Oz, a film he'd watched in Paris in 1940, before the world caught fire. The geography of imprisonment Camp Concordia sat on 760 acres of Kansas wheatland, surrounded by barbed wire that seemed almost apologetic in its abundance, 12 guard towers, 42 barracks, 3 mess halls, 2 hospitals, 1 chapel that served all faiths, and therefore none completely. The camp could hold 4,000 men. On July 23, 1944, it held 3,812. They were, according to regulations, the enemy. They were fed, according to the Geneva Convention, the same rations as American soldiers. The dissonance began immediately. Prisoner Hans Wober, a corporal from München who had surrendered in Tunisia, kept a diary that would eventually be published in 1978. His entry from his 3rd day at Concordia: "Today they gave us each 1 egg, 4 strips of bacon, 2 pieces of toast with real butter, coffee with sugar. I have not eaten this well in 2 years of serving the Wehrmacht." My father in Germany eats turnips and watered milk. I am in a prison. This makes no sense. The prisoners waited for the revelation of cruelty. It must be coming. This abundance must be preparation for greater deprivation. The Americans were clever. Fatten them first, then starve them. That would be the psychological torture. Except it never came. Week after week, month after month, the food remained. Not luxurious, but sufficient. More than sufficient. In fact, because of agricultural labor programs where prisoners worked in local farms, many ate better than they had as free soldiers in the Wehrmacht. Colonel Park understood the strategic purpose of this abundance, though he rarely articulated it. Feed a man well, and you begin to erode the foundation of his hate. Show him that the enemy is not what he was told, and you create a crack in the ideological fortress. Pour water into that crack, the water of ordinary human decency, and watch how the fortress begins to crumble. But crumbling takes time, and some men resist the collapse longer than others. General Kurt Reinhardt resisted for 49 days. The Invisible Army Thomas Hendricks had enlisted 3 days after Pearl Harbor. He was 17. He lied about his age. His brother James, 2 years younger, enlisted the following year with the same lie, the same recruiter who chose not to ask uncomfortable questions when the nation needed bodies more than birth certificates. Their mother had wept. Their father, who had lost a leg at Belleau Wood in the previous war, had said nothing, which was worse than weeping. Thomas made sergeant by 1943, assigned to prisoner of war camp duty because someone had to do it, and the men who could fight were needed elsewhere. He did not feel like a soldier. He felt like a clerk with a rifle, counting Germans like inventory, ensuring they stayed fed and healthy for what? Eventually they would return to Germany. Eventually they would rebuild what they had tried to destroy. The moral calculus made his head hurt. But orders were orders. And the Germans, he had to admit, were easier to guard than he expected. They followed rules with a precision that was almost mechanical. They saluted him, an American sergeant, with the same deference they would have shown their own officers. Some of them spoke English better than half the boys from Thomas's own company. General Reinhardt was different. The general arrived at Concordia on June 30th, arm in a sling, face carrying the particular pallor of recent surgery and older sorrows. Unlike other prisoners who seemed almost relieved to be in captivity, safe from bullets and bombs, Reinhardt carried his imprisonment like a physical weight. He spoke to no one unless protocol demanded it. He ate alone. He read books in 4 languages, alternating with a pattern Thomas couldn't discern, German, then French, then English, then something that looked like Latin. And he watched, always watching, taking in the camp with the assessment of a man still conducting reconnaissance, still looking for weakness, still believing the war might somehow require his presence again. Thomas found this unnerving. The other Germans could be understood. They were beaten men, grateful to be alive. But Reinhardt seemed neither beaten nor grateful. He seemed to be waiting, though for what, Thomas couldn't imagine. Until July 23rd, until the telegram, until everything simple became complicated, and everything complicated became something else entirely. The moment before, the mess hall piano had been donated by the Concordia Methodist Church in 1942, a gesture of Christian charity toward enemies that many in town found perplexing, if not borderline treasonous. Reverend Paul Timmons had been firm. Even prisoners need music. Especially prisoners need music. The piano was old even then, a 1908 Steinway that had served 3 generations of Sunday services before arthritis, and age convinced the congregation to purchase something newer. It arrived at Camp Concordia on a flatbed truck slightly out of tune, missing several ivories, the middle C sticking whenever humidity exceeded 70%, which in Kansas summer meant always. Various prisoners had attempted it, a few simple German songs. Some careful Bach, once a spirited but ultimately unsuccessful attempt at Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata by a former music teacher from Hamburg. The Americans listened politely. The Germans listened out of obligation. No one expected miracles from a donated piano in a prisoner of war camp. Reinhardt had circled it for 48 days. He would enter the mess hall, see the piano, feel something in his chest tighten, then leave. His shoulder wound had healed sufficiently by mid-July. The doctors cleared him for light activity. The piano qualified as light activity. But for 48 days he could not bring himself to touch the keys, until the morning of July 23rd, when he woke from a dream about his son. Friedrich Reinhardt had died at Stalingrad on January 14, 1943. He was 19 years old. He had written to his father 3 days before, "It is cold here, but we hold. The Führer promises relief. I believe in him, Vater. I believe in Germany. I believe we will win." Kurt never wrote back. There was no time. The letter arrived the same day the Red Army closed the final corridor. Friedrich died of frostbite and starvation in a basement bunker with 43 other young men who believed their Führer would save them. For 18 months, Kurt had not allowed himself to think about Friedrich's last moments. The mind has defenses against such thoughts, trapdoors that drop you into numbness before the pain can take root. But in dreams, defenses fail. In the dream, Friedrich was playing piano, not at Stalingrad, not in some frozen bunker, but in the old house in Potsdam, in the music room that Kurt's mother had insisted upon, where young Kurt had learned scales before he learned to properly march. Friedrich, who had never studied music, who had joined the Hitler Youth at 12 and the Wehrmacht at 17, who had died believing in lies until they killed him. Friedrich was playing a melody Kurt recognized but could not name. When Kurt woke, he knew what he had to do. The breaking point, Thomas Hendricks entered the mess hall at 1900 hours, 37 minutes after receiving the telegram about his brother James. His hands shook. His vision had narrowed to a tunnel. Everything outside that tunnel was noise, meaningless, unconnected to the single burning fact that James was dead and Germans were alive, and that mathematics was wrong, fundamentally wrong, morally wrong. The baton was in his hand. He didn't remember drawing it. General Reinhardt sat at the piano, alone. The other prisoners had left after dinner, returning to barracks for the evening count. But Reinhardt remained, fingers on the keys, head bowed as if in prayer or consultation with ghosts. "You," Thomas heard himself say. His voice sounded alien, coming from somewhere outside his body. "You fucking people." Reinhardt turned slowly. His face showed no fear, no surprise, just a kind of weary recognition, as if he had been expecting this moment, this confrontation, this inevitable collision between grief and circumstance. "Sergeant," Reinhardt said quietly in English, carrying only the faintest accent, "I can see you have received news. Don't you?" Thomas's voice broke. "Don't you dare. Don't you dare speak to me like we." He crossed the distance between them in 4 steps, raised the baton. Reinhardt did not move, did not flinch, did not raise his hands in defense. He simply looked at Thomas with eyes that carried something Thomas recognized but could not, in that moment, name. "My brother," Thomas said, and the words came out as a sob. "My brother is dead. My brother is dead. And you're here. You're here, eating our food, sleeping in a bed, safe, alive. And my brother is dead in France because of you. Because of your goddamn Führer and your goddamn war and your—" "Stalingrad," Reinhardt said softly. "January 14th, 1943. My son, Friedrich, 19 years old. He believed in victory until the moment he froze to death." The baton wavered. "I have seen that look before," Reinhardt continued, his voice carrying the careful control of a man who knows that one wrong word will shatter everything. "In mirrors, in windows, in the reflection of water when I cannot avoid seeing myself. That look of pain that makes you want to destroy something, anything, because the world should not continue to exist when the person you love no longer does." "Shut up," Thomas whispered. "I will not shut up." Reinhardt's voice gained strength. "Because you need to hear this. Your brother died in Normandy. My son died at Stalingrad. They died in different armies for different flags, believing different lies. But they died the same death. young men fed into the machinery of old men's ambitions. And we survived. We are here, and that is the cruelty neither of us can escape. You're a Nazi, Thomas said, but the certainty had leaked from the words. I am a German general who served his country. Your country dropped bombs on my cities. My country invaded your allies. We can trade atrocities until dawn, Sergeant, and we will both be correct. History will judge which of us was more monstrous. But in this moment, in this room, we are two fathers who survived their sons. Pain has no nationality, son. Thomas lowered the baton. His hands were still shaking. The telegram was still crushed in his fist. James was still dead. But something in the arithmetic had shifted, some equation he didn't know how to solve anymore. Why are you at the piano? He asked finally. Reinhardt turned back to the keys. Because I made a promise to myself when I woke this morning. I have been avoiding this instrument for 49 days, avoiding what it represents, what it reminds me of. But this morning I dreamed of my son, and I realized— He paused, his fingers finding the keys. I realized that the only way to honor the dead is to remember that we were human before we were enemies. I don't understand, Thomas said. You will, Reinhardt replied. Listen. The music. The first notes of St. Louis blues emerged from the damaged piano like a confession, like a secret too long held, like the truth that war tries to kill but cannot quite murder. You see, Handy had written it in 1914, before either war, before either man had known what war meant. It was American. It was black. It was everything the Third Reich had labeled degenerate, and it was beautiful with a kind of beauty that ideology cannot erase, that propaganda cannot touch, that hate cannot diminish. Reinhardt played it with the skill of someone who had spent years learning not just the notes, but the spaces between notes, the silence that gives music meaning. The melody moved through the damaged piano, accommodating its stuck keys and missing ivories, turning imperfection into a kind of authenticity that a perfect instrument could never achieve. The sound carried through the open windows of the mess hall. It reached the guard towers where men looked at each other in confusion. It reached the barracks where German prisoners emerged cautiously, drawn by music that should not exist in this place, played by a man who should not know it. It reached the camp headquarters where Colonel Park stopped mid-sentence in a phone call to Washington and listened. And it reached Thomas Hendricks, who stood frozen 5 feet from the piano, the baton loose in his hand, the telegram still crushed in his other fist, and felt something break inside him that had been cracking since 1900 hours, since the moment he read those 13 words that ended his brother's existence. He sank to the floor. Not a collapse, a slow descent. The body finally admitting what the mind had been denying, that James was gone, that the world continued, that grief was not a thing that could be fought or denied, but only endured. The music continued. Reinhardt transitioned from St. Louis blues to Body and Soul. Coleman Hawkins' recording from 1939 that Kurt had listened to in Paris while the continent prepared for war. The melody seemed to acknowledge Thomas's grief, to wrap around it without trying to diminish it, to say, yes, this is unbearable, and yes, you must bear it anyway. Other prisoners gathered at the windows. They saw their general, the aristocrat, the bearer of the Knight's Cross, the man who had commanded thousands, playing American jazz with tears on his face. They saw the American sergeant on the floor, weeping. They saw something that violated every certainty they had carried into captivity. Private Morrison, who had discovered the jazz records weeks earlier, watched from the doorway. Later, he would write to his sister, I saw 2 enemies become 2 men. I don't know how to explain it better than that. The music played for 17 minutes. When Reinhardt finally lifted his hands from the keys, the silence that followed was not empty, but full of everything that music had said that words could not, full of the acknowledgement that suffering is universal even when its causes are particular, full of the terrible knowledge that humanity persists despite our best efforts to kill it. Reinhardt stood. His shoulder ached. His fingers trembled. He turned to find Thomas still on the floor, face wet, breathing ragged. "Come," Reinhardt said, extending his hand. "Stand up, Sergeant. Your brother would want you to stand." Thomas took the hand, let himself be pulled upright. They stood there, German general and American sergeant, separated by every possible category of difference, nation, rank, age, cause, and connected by the single thread of grief that makes all men kin. "I'm sorry," Thomas said, not knowing precisely what he was apologizing for. The baton, the rage, the impulse toward violence, all of it, none of it. "We are all sorry," Reinhardt replied. "That is perhaps the only certainty war offers. We survive, and we are sorry." They stood in silence for a moment that lasted either 10 seconds or 10 hours. Time had become unreliable. Then Reinhardt walked past Thomas toward the door, toward the barracks, toward another night in captivity that suddenly felt less like imprisonment and more like a strange kind of sanctuary. At the door, he paused. Without turning, he said, "Your brother's name?" "James," Thomas answered. "Private James Hendricks." "I will remember him," Reinhardt said. "Friedrich and James. I will remember them both." Then he was gone, leaving Thomas alone in the mess hall with a piano, a baton, a telegram, and the wreckage of certainties he had carried into that room 37 minutes earlier. The night after Kurt Reinhardt did not sleep. Sleep had become unreliable since Stalingrad, arriving in fragments, bringing dreams he could not control, and memories he could not escape. He lay in his bunk, third on the left, by the window that looked toward what he had learned was north, toward home, toward a country that was being destroyed city by city, while he sat in Kansas eating eggs and bacon. The other prisoners slept around him. They had witnessed the music. Tomorrow they would ask questions. Tomorrow he would have to explain why a German general knew American jazz. Tomorrow, the careful distance he had maintained for 49 days would collapse, and he would become something other than the commanding officer, the aristocrat, the bearer of dignified silence. But tonight, in the darkness, he allowed himself to remember. Paris, 1932, before the Nazis, before the war, before the world decided that music could have politics and politics could have victims. He was 36, already a major in the Reichswehr, in Paris for a conference on artillery tactics that bored him senseless. On the third night, unable to bear another evening of official dinners and strategic discussions, he had slipped away to Montmartre, Le Haut Club de France, a basement venue where American expatriates and European enthusiasts gathered to worship at the altar of improvisation. That night, Django Reinhardt, no relation, though Kurt had joked about adopting him, played guitar with a fury that seemed to set the air on fire. And there, in that basement, surrounded by people who would soon be enemies, Kurt Reinhardt had felt more at home than he ever felt in officers' clubs or parade grounds. He had returned every night of the conference, started collecting records, began learning the piano parts, teaching himself in hotel rooms across Europe, in garrison towns, in the brief peaceful moments before the continent remembered how to destroy itself. When the Nazis took power, when Goebbels began his crusade against degenerate art, Kurt hid his records like contraband. Because they were contraband, not just musically but philosophically. Jazz was everything the Reich opposed: improvisational, collaborative, black, American, free. To love jazz was to admit that the ideology was wrong, that the categories were false, that human beings could create beauty across all the lines that politics tried to draw. He had never told Friedrich. His son had grown up in the new Germany, educated in the new schools, shaped by the new certainties. How could Kurt explain to a boy who wore the Hitler Youth uniform with such pride that his father preferred Duke Ellington to Richard Wagner, that he found more truth in Louis Armstrong's trumpet than in all of Goebbels's speeches? Now Friedrich was dead, and Kurt was alive, and the records were still in his footlocker, and he had finally played the music he had been hiding for 12 years. The truth, he realized, was both simpler and more complicated than he had allowed himself to acknowledge. He had been on the wrong side, not tactically, not strategically, morally, fundamentally. The Americans who had saved his life, who fed him, who treated him with a basic dignity that the Wehrmacht had systematically denied to Russian prisoners. They were right, and he had been wrong. This was not a comfortable truth. This was not a truth that allowed for sleep. This was a truth that demanded something: confession, penance, transformation, though what form that could take in a prisoner of war camp, he did not know. His heart felt strange, a flutter, an arrhythmia. He had felt it before, since Stalingrad, since the days of starvation and cold that had damaged more than just his men's bodies. The doctors in Cherbourg had mentioned it. Stress-induced cardiomyopathy, they called it. The heart muscle weakened by extreme physical and psychological trauma. Rest, they had said. Avoid stress. As if war and imprisonment and moral collapse could be avoided like bad weather. The flutter became a squeeze, a tightness in his chest that spread down his left arm, across his jaw. He knew what this was. He was a soldier. He had seen enough death to recognize its approach. He could call for help. There were guards. There were doctors. The Americans would try to save him again, as they had saved him in Cherbourg, as they had saved him from his own country's ideology. But Kurt Reinhardt was tired, so very tired, tired of surviving, tired of witnessing, tired of the impossible mathematics that kept him alive while better men died. Friedrich, James Hendricks, the countless others who would never see this strange peace that felt nothing like victory. He reached for the paper on the small shelf beside his bunk, found a pen, began to write, fighting the pain that made his fingers clumsy, that narrowed his vision to a tunnel of diminishing light. To Sergeant Thomas Hendricks, he wrote, "I do not know if the dead can make requests of the living, but I make this request anyway. Live for two. Live for your brother James, who will not see tomorrow. And live for my son Friedrich, who believed in lies until they killed him. Make their deaths mean something by refusing to let grief turn into hate. I played music tonight because it was the only language left that told the truth. Remember that truth. Remember that we are human first, and everything else, nation, rank, ideology, distant second. With respect and sorrow, General Kurt Reinhardt." He folded the letter, placed it on his chest, closed his eyes. The pain was considerable, but not unbearable. Nothing, he had learned, was truly unbearable. You could bear anything. You could bear your son's death. You could bear your country's evil. You could bear the knowledge that you had served monstrosity with competence and honor. You could bear all of it, right up until the moment your heart decided it had borne enough. The last thing Kurt Reinhardt heard was not screaming, not explosions, not the sounds that had filled his ears for 6 years of war. It was music, the memory of body and soul as he had played it that evening, imperfect, honest, free. His heart stopped at 0200 hours, July 24, 1944. The morning after Private Morrison found the body at 0500 during routine bunk check. The general lay peacefully, the letter still on his chest, his face carrying an expression that Morrison would later describe as almost relieved. The camp doctor confirmed what was obvious. Cardiac arrest, probably occurring around 0200. No struggle, no pain beyond what the heart itself inflicted. A quiet death, as deaths go. Certainly quieter than Friedrich at Stalingrad. Certainly quieter than James at Normandy. Colonel Park read the letter, read it again, then handed it to Sergeant Hendricks, who stood in the office at 0700, called in before breakfast, before he could prepare himself for whatever news required such early summoning. Thomas read the letter 3 times. He felt something break that had survived the previous evening's breaking, some deeper layer of certainty, some final defense against the knowledge that war makes enemies of people who should have been friends, and sometimes, too late, allows them to recognize each other. He was a Nazi, Thomas said finally, knowing the objection was required, that someone had to say it, that history would judge and find wanting any sympathy for a German general. He was, Park agreed. He was also a man who played jazz and mourned his son, and tried, at the end, to save you from becoming what grief wanted to make you. Protocol says we bury him in the camp cemetery, prisoner's grave, regulation marker. What do you think we should do, Sergeant? Thomas thought about 13 words on a telegram, about Friedrich freezing in Stalingrad, about a piano in a mess hall, about the impossibility of hate-surviving music. Full honors, he said. We bury him with full honors. That violates every regulation in the book, Park said, but he was smiling. Good, we'll do it. The burial, they held the service on July 25th at 1600 hours in the camp cemetery where 12 other prisoners had been buried, men who had died of illness or accident, or the quiet failures of bodies that had endured too much. Thomas Hendricks stood at attention beside the grave. He had volunteered for the honor guard. 7 other Americans joined him. Morrison Wu, the medic who had saved Reinhardt's life in Cherbourg, and 5 others who had been in the mess hall that evening, who had heard the music. The German prisoners gathered on the opposite side. They had fashioned an iron cross from scrap metal, polished until it caught the Kansas sun. Lieutenant Muller, who had pulled Reinhardt from the wreckage at Cherbourg, held the cross with hands that shook. Colonel Park read from the Book of Common Prayer, the same words used for American soldiers. I am the resurrection and the life, saith the Lord. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. They lowered the coffin, simple pine, same as any prisoner, but draped with both flags, American and German side by side in a violation of protocol that seemed, in that moment, like the only honest thing to do. Thomas raised his rifle. The honor guard fired 3 volleys into the Kansas sky. The sound echoed across the wheat fields, across the camp, across a war that had another 9 months to run before it would finally exhaust itself. When the service ended, the prisoners filed past the grave. Each dropped something, a button from their uniform, a photograph, a small token. Muller placed the iron cross on the fresh earth. For my general, he said in German, who remembered he was human. Thomas was last. He placed his own item beside the cross, the Western Union telegram that had started everything, 13 words that had killed James Hendricks, and in their way had killed Kurt Reinhardt too, or maybe revealed him, or maybe both. I'll remember, Thomas said to the grave, Friedrich and James. I'll remember them both. He turned to find the German prisoners watching him. Young men, old men, corporals and captains and career soldiers who had believed in victory until victory became impossible. They saw him see them. And something passed between them, not forgiveness, which would have been premature and perhaps dishonest, but recognition. The acknowledgement that they were men before they were enemies, that grief was universal even when its causes were particular, that music told truths that ideology tried to kill. The aftermath. Thomas Hendricks served out the war at Camp Concordia. When victory came in May 1945, when the prisoners were repatriated to a Germany that barely existed anymore, Thomas shook hands with Lieutenant Muller at the camp gate. Take care of yourself, kid, Thomas said. You also, Muller replied in careful English. Remember what the general taught us. I will, Thomas promised. He kept that promise. After the war, Thomas used the GI Bill to study music at the University of Kansas. He never became a professional musician. His fingers were too stiff, his training too late. But he taught music in Kansas City for 37 years in schools that were slowly, painfully integrating, teaching black and white children together that music recognized no racial lines, no national boundaries, no ideological barriers. He played jazz, always jazz. And when his students asked why, he would tell them about a German general in a prison camp who had played Saint. Lewis blues on a broken piano and reminded an American sergeant that humanity persists despite our best efforts to destroy it. The letter from General Reinhardt hung framed in his classroom. Students would read it, ask questions. Thomas would answer as honestly as he could. Yes, the general had been a Nazi. Yes, he had served an evil regime. Yes, there were no simple heroes in this story. But there were human beings, making human choices, trying to find meaning in the wreckage of certainties. In 1978, when Hans Weber's diary was published, Thomas received a copy from the author. It included an entry from July 24th, 1944. Last night, General Reinhardt played American jazz. This morning, he is dead. I do not understand this war anymore. Perhaps I never did. Thomas wrote back to Weber. None of us understood it. That was the point. That was what the general was trying to tell us. They corresponded for 7 years, until Weber's death in 1985. Two old men, former enemies, trading letters about music and memory, and the terrible price of learning, too late that the other side was human too. The epilogue. The piano from Camp Concordia still exists. After the war, when the camp was dismantled and the barracks sold for scrap, Reverend Timmons reclaimed it. It sat in the Concordia Methodist Church basement for 43 years, gathering dust, the middle C still sticking when humidity exceeded 70%. In 1988, the church donated it to the Kansas Museum of History. It sits there now in a permanent exhibition about the prisoner of war camps that dotted America during World War II. A placard explains its history. A recording plays on loop, not Reinhardt's actual performance, which was never recorded, but a recreation based on Thomas Hendrix's descriptions. St. Louis Blues and Body and Soul played on the actual piano, with all its imperfections preserved. Visitors can touch the keys. Some do, pressing middle C, feeling it stick, releasing it, hearing the slightly flat note emerge. Children ask their parents why a Nazi general knew American jazz. Parents struggle to answer because the answer requires acknowledging complexity in a story we prefer to tell simply, as a tale of good defeating evil, of democracy triumphing over fascism, of clarity emerging from chaos. But the truth, as always, is more complicated. The truth is that General Kurt Reinhardt loved American jazz and served the Third Reich, that Sergeant Thomas Hendrix wanted to kill him, and instead learned from him. That music can tell truths that ideology denies, that grief is universal even when its causes are particular, that we are human first, and everything else, nation, rank, race, creed, a distant, distant second. Pain has no nationality, the general said. And in saying it, he gave Thomas Hendrix a gift more valuable than any victory, the knowledge that surviving is not enough, that living requires remembering not just who died, but what they died believing, and choosing, deliberately, painfully, consciously choosing to believe something better. On the museum wall beside the piano hangs a photograph from the burial. You can see Thomas Hendrix at attention, rifle raised for the salute. You can see the German prisoners on the opposite side of the grave, their faces carrying expressions too complex for easy categorization. You can see both flags, American and German, draped across a simple pine coffin. And if you look closely in the background, slightly out of focus, you can see the mess hall through which music traveled one summer evening in 1944, carrying a message that war tried to kill but could not quite murder. We are human, all of us, even when we forget, even when we deny it, even when ideology and hate and fear try to convince us otherwise. The piano remembers. Middle C still sticks. The note still emerges slightly flat, trembling in the air like a question that has no answer, or perhaps like an answer we are still learning how to ask.